welcome to FA Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh in Pune, India today.
And I'm Glenn Carl, south of Boston, Massachusetts.
Brilliant. Without further ado, we are going to dive straight in. The three issues for this month that both of us are going to tackle are, number one, drama in Russia-Ukraine war. No surprises there. Number two, Narendra Modi's consequential Washington trip. Number three, economic stresses impel China to seek rapprochement with the US. So, Glenn, since you are the retired CIA officer and since you lived through the Cold War, educate us as to what is going on.
Okay, well, I often found in my career, that the intelligence officers, in a sense, have the easier job because our job is to explain what is going on, and that's hard. That's hard to do because often most people don't know what they're doing themselves, and that's not a facetious comment. But the harder job is then to know what to do with the information that one has. What decisions and actions does one take, and that's a very hard thing. However, with that humble, if not false, humble comment said, the three issues that we've chosen very deeply are interwoven with one another. And I think a three-body problem is one of the hardest, is an unsolvable problem in physics and in math. So are international relations. But those are the three that are playing out historically for us. Now, by drama in the Russia-Ukraine war, what do I mean? What do we mean? Of course, the issue on everyone's mind that has riveted the whole world is the warlord Prigozhin's adventure. His marvelous adventure, and why he did it, what it means, what are the implications, the consequences of that. So everyone will know that Prigozhin has been the creator of and the leader of the Wagner paramilitary mercenary group. It was created really as an arm of the foreign and military policy of Russia that Russia could claim distance from. But it's always been controlled by the Kremlin and the Russian intelligence services.
It's plausible deniability, Glenn. I seem to remember you told me it's similar to Pakistan creating proxies against India.
And they can say, well, we don't control this. We have nothing to do with it. It's not us. There's more than a snippet of truth to those denials, and of course they're complete lies at the same time. But truth and lies cohabit simultaneously. So it was created to conduct proxy wars and extend Russian policy objectives. Really, in Africa first. In Libya, they have been and are very involved in the war there. In Mali now, they have de facto supplanted the French as the kingmakers and holding the government up. In other parts of Africa, they are supporting governments that are in the gold and diamond trade, that provide blood diamonds, as it were, money to finance the Wagner Group. But with the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, they became the most effective fighting force for Russia in the war. Why did Prigozhin march on Moscow briefly? Because once the symbolic, quote, victory, unquote, of taking the ruins of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine was achieved, you can claim it was achieved, I suppose, then the regular army replaced the Wagner forces that did that at the cost of over 100,000 lives for a few square kilometers of literally abandoned ruins of no strategic significance. Then the regular army replaced the Wagner forces, and Putin and the Russian Ministry of Defense moved to take control, finally, of what was now a 25,000-man army, not taking orders directly from the Kremlin, or at least not from the professional military. And Prigozhin was threatened by this, because if the forces were taken out of his control and the weapons were no longer being supplied, we all heard him complaining, what's the word, using epithets about how he wasn't being supplied as he needed with ammunition or weapons. Then if he doesn't have the tools of making war, and he doesn't have the ability to command his own forces, he has been castrated and removed from influence. And perhaps most importantly, at the same time that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Kremlin were moving to take those two steps on materiel and on command and control, the Russian government was moving to remove his control, Prigozhin's control, of the logistical contracts supplying the Russian Ministry of Defense. All of the food products that are provided to the Russian soldiers, and many other logistical ancillary support efforts or requirements, Prigozhin's Wagner Group provided, and his other businesses. And with the loss of all those things, Prigozhin becomes a nobody. So he thought, well, what am I going to do about this? And he was complaining. He was trying to have his nemesis, the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, removed, and he failed.
Sergei Shoigu.
So, Shoigu, yes. So I think, frankly, what happened, and this is, I don't have the clinical evidence to prove it, but we know that he's a heavy drinker. And we've seen him repeatedly making his filmed screeds while clearly under the heavy influence of alcohol. And I think he started to become, clearly he was alarmed at what was happening to him, because when he lost those three pillars, which were all of what makes him a power, then he would not be only a nobody, but he would probably be in danger from the Minister of Defense and from Putin himself. And so in a moment of pique, he thought, I'm going to, it was unclear how coherent his thoughts were. I will remove the problem, which is the Minister of Defense, or I'll seize control of the government. And the U.S. intelligence community, the CIA, has reporting that most of you will have heard snippets of, that this was not only decided on the spur of the moment, but that Prigozhin had been in contact with various commanders in the Russian military to see if they would support a move. And they apparently indicated that they would. And initially, some did, if only by doing nothing. But then Prigozhin, not being the most strategic or deep of thinkers, because let's remember what this guy is. He was a street thug from St. Petersburg, who got in with the guy who won the lottery of national power, and he's ruthless, but not particularly deep thinking, although he seems to be honest in his statements in some ways. He then realized that his entire force was 25,000 people, and absent support from other elements of the Russian military, it was more than unlikely that he could succeed if opposed, as was becoming certain to be the case by the Russian military. Also, we hear from Western intelligence, I think the CIA, that Putin let it be known, quite wisely, but typically ruthlessly, that if the Wagner units continued up the road towards Moscow, that the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, would kill all of the family members of the Wagner commanders, as well as Prigozhin's himself. And so it seems he got cold feet, but he also saw that he couldn't win. And Putin, on his side, rather than being ruthless. You can argue that he showed weakness, as some conventional punditry positions seem to take, or that he was astute and he removed the problem through threats and exile. And we know the fate of people who oppose the king. I've said it before, it doesn't get remotely the attention that I believe that it should. But there have been at least 49 Russians who have been assassinated in Great Britain, just Great Britain, in the last 15 years. There was just an assassination attempt in the United States, and that is highly unusual, by the Russian intelligence service of a source of the CIA's. So they are ruthless. They've always been ruthless, but now doing it in the U.S. and doing it with impunity
it's an old tradition.
Is crossing a line.
It's an old tradition, Glenn. It goes back to Leon Trotsky in Mexico and so many others.
Yes, yeah, and the arm is long and doesn't get tired. It took 15 years or 20 years to get Trotsky, and so why not let him go and do whatever he's going to be doing in Bulgaria? So those seem to be the motivations to me. Now, the view also of the sort of standard view of the punditry is that this shows the brittleness of Putin and of the Russian regime, and I frankly don't accept that assessment at all. I think that, of course, the regime is brittle because it's totalitarian, but it is all powerful until it breaks. Now, it could be that a military commander someplace in Russia will do something that will succeed. At some point, something will happen. But I don't think that this shows particular weakness. The Russian state has always been corrupt, viewed cynically, with competing warlords supporting the one man who has the control of them momentarily. So I don't really see it as a sign of the weakness of the empire, of its decay and its brittleness, perhaps, yes, but I don't see that as particularly new. Now, what's going on? How does this affect the larger war? Putin is no dummy, and he is, and here I accept the conventional views. He's playing for time now because he can't go further in Ukraine. And the longer the war drags out, the more used, are Ukrainian forces, and more likely is a fracturing of support. It's much harder in the West. It's much harder to hold dozens of countries together than it is to hold a single totalitarian state on a given policy. And that could possibly succeed. The Ukrainian offensive, unfortunately, and this is not a slight of either Ukrainian planning or skills, has to defeat, I think it is 100 kilometers wide of mined and trenched front, over a front of 800 kilometers of length. They will choose what they hope to be a decisive point. But that's an incredibly difficult challenge when the Russians have been taking a year to prepare. Further, there's the conventional view is, how bad the Russian military is. And a lot of that is true. Their local command decisions, their hierarchies, their efficiency, their corruption, all of that is all true. But they aren't idiots. They're as brilliant as anyone else, and they learn from their mistakes. And with their efficiencies, they nonetheless remain a major power militarily, both as to resources, potential, and in fact, even after all of their losses. So the challenge is substantial for the Ukrainians. The effects of the Prigozhin drama, I think, may play out over time, but for the current war circumstances, I don't see them having too much effect. And the challenge is for the Ukrainians to be able to make a breakthrough. They are killing 1,000 Russians a day, and probably 25 pieces of heavy armor, and that is also a big strain on Russia. So the outcome is uncertain.
And just to point out, Glenn, that Ukrainians are suffering massive casualties as well. And their economy has suffered a lot more than Russia's. Russia's contracted, as we pointed out earlier, by 1.5 by not a significant margin, while Ukrainian GDP cratered. So Ukrainians are under huge duress. And if this is a battle of attrition, then the Ukrainians have fewer men to lose. And therefore, the odds are stacked against them. Speaking of odds, very quickly, before we move on to the next topic, let's very quickly examine the consequences of the blowing up of a certain dam. Kakhovka Dam on Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast was completed in 1956. On 6 June 2023, it ceased to exist. This means about 700,000 people will be without water. The Kakhovka reservoir is nearly dry. It's about 5,840 square kilometers. That is 2,255 square miles of cropland on both sides of Dnipro River. Basically will not have irrigation. Importantly, Ukraine accounts for 10% of the world wheat market, 15% of the corn market, 13% of the barley market, and more than 50% of the world trade in the sunflower oil market. Now, over the last year, food prices have actually come down. Food prices have stabilized. That's what the International Monetary Fund data tells us. Both Glenn and I were reviewing it thanks to our colleague, the managing partner of Fair Observer Intelligence, who did all the data crunching. Sanjay Acharya, he gave us those insights. And prima facie, it doesn't seem food prices will be a problem. Having said that, Martin Griffiths, the emergency relief coordinator for the UN, has told the BBC that the blowing up of the dam would cause a huge impact on global food security, because this area is not just a breadbasket, not only for Ukraine, but also the world. So there is going to be a shock, potential food price shock. And those of you who are watching that space, and if you're CEOs and investors, you could possibly be looking at food companies for business. Before we move on very quickly, let's take some questions. Peter Isaacson, ever indefatigable, has asked, how does Wagner compare with Blackwater? And then Shiju Verghese asks that could the CIA have been behind it, thinking they've recruited Prigozhin to take out Putin, only for him to double-cross them, having been in cahoots with Putin all along. So Glenn, I'll let you answer both these fantastic gentlemen.
Blackwater is dramatically smaller than Wagner, but it is true that they are essentially mercenaries, yeah, and they do, at a much smaller level, have done roughly similar things in Africa, largely. I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, they are, with differences nonetheless in really the nature of what each the respective governments behind them, the United States and Russia respectively, will accept as allowable behavior. So Wagner does things like execute people on film with a sledgehammer, and there have been there's one infamous case of Blackwater people in Iraq, now literally 19 years ago, I think it was, not too long after the U.S. invasion, when they went on a shooting spree. They were happily prosecuted because this came out, and that's not condoned in the same ways that it is under Wagner. But yes, Wagner and Blackwater are mercenary outfits.
Or private military companies, if we want to use the right epithet.
Well, okay. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, I suppose. And the other question was, it was even...
Everything's a CIA plot.
A phenomenal one. That's right. They asked me to be involved, and I declined. I thought that was just... No. More plausible, but still a dramatic stretch, would have been or would be that the Ukrainian intelligence service, which we know was in contact with Prigozhin, made some sort of a deal with him. But that's also extremely unlikely. That the CIA did it. I have had. I was involved in covert actions, and they're very hard to do, to keep secret, and to ever control, which is essentially never the case. And it would just have been a wild Hollywood plot that the CIA would never even dream of trying, that I can see, or the U.S. government. It's hard to articulate how many ways it would be
it could blow
unlikely for the CIA to try to do something with a warlord like that. No. Now, it's true in 1918 to 20 or so, the U.S. sent part of the U.S. Army to support the White Russians in the Civil War. That kind of activity, even then, was sort of benighted, but imaginable. But to cut a deal with the most powerful warlord in Russia is not. That's the stuff out of the Three Kingdoms book from 1,500 years ago in China, but not the CIA.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.